his word. In my heart, how I yearn for their spirit's return. And I cry as time flies. There is a place where love will always shine, and rainbows are the shadows of a love that's so divine. And the glow of that love will light the sky up above, and it's free. Can't you see? Come with me. The Creator has a master plan, peace and happiness for every man. The Creator has a master plan, happiness for every man. The Creator has a working plan, happiness for every man. The Creator has a master plan.
Welcome, everyone. Hello. My name is Sierra Peters, and I am the Communications Director at Boston Ujima Project. And on behalf of everyone at Boston Ujima Project, I'd like to welcome you to the next event in our A Loving Embrace series. This event is titled, How Can Communities Work Together to Acquire and Control Property? I'm going to ask everybody to do a brief round of applause for all of our guests. Before I hand it over, I just want to introduce Boston Ujima Project to anyone who might be new to this space. The Boston Ujima Project is building a cooperative business, arts, and investment ecosystem built by and for Boston's Black, Indigenous, and communities of color. Um, Over the past month, Ujima members and the wider public have had the opportunity to learn about real estate development, review investment opportunities, and in the future, generate a real estate investment plan for the Ujima Fund's 2022 plans. Before I hand the mic over to Maggie Cohn of CFNE, I'd like to thank our partners, the Black Economic Council of Massachusetts, Glenn Lloyd, the Cooperative Fund of New England, Boston Impact Initiative, Fenway CDC, Boston Neighborhood Community Land Trust, Local Enterprise Assistance Fund, or LEAF, Somerville Community Cooperation, and Dudley Street Neighborhood Initiative. So I'm gonna hand it over to you, Maggie, to welcome everybody and get us started.
Thank you, Sierra. This is actually very cool. I'm really excited to be here. And thank you for inviting us to do this. As I think we all know, and we have been learning a lot through this series of workshops with Ujima, access to property ownership has historically been systematically denied to large segments of our population. And at the same time, housing and property have been commodified, seen primarily as wealth vehicles and not as an essential right. We want to look at what do we mean by ownership? And what do we mean when we talk about wealth building, financial security, as a way to build wealth or as a way to build community wealth, individual wealth, as a way to control decisions? There are just a lot of aspects here. We want to try to take this apart a little bit. We're going to talk about several modes for communities to buy and control property, housing cooperatives, which can build ownership and equity and provide stable and affordable housing. Resident-owned communities, or ROCs, where the residents of manufactured housing communities buy the land on which their homes sit. Land trusts, which also provide security and can provide a springboard for individuals to build wealth. and permanent real estate cooperatives, or PRECs, in which community members join together to purchase property and control its use. We want to think about how each model plays into wealth building and what kind of wealth building, how they provide security, and how they allow other ways for people to accrue individual or community wealth. What is the role of individual financial participation in each of these models, and where is there a need for external financing, and what can that look like? We'll offer short presentations on each model, and then we're going to open it up for a general discussion with all of you. So please use the chat to enter your questions or challenges that you see as we go along, and these will then feed into our follow-up conversation. With us tonight, we have Meredith Levy or Levy? Meredith, which way do you pronounce your last name? Oh, you're muted. The curse of the 21st century.
Sorry, Levy.
Levy. With us tonight, we have Meredith Levy, who joined the Boston Neighborhood Community Land Trust in January 2020 as executive director. She brings 20 years of experience from the community development sector with a background in community organizing, focusing on social and economic equity, anti-displacement, and land use. Meredith studied emerging approaches to community capital and finance as a Lisk Rubinger Fellow in 2018, and is committed to exploring creative acquisition strategies for housing justice through the community land trust model. Julia Curry, Julia, you want to wave at the audience? Works for the Cooperative Development Institute in Vermont as an advisor to manufactured home park co-ops known as resident-owned communities, or ROCs. Prior to this, she coordinated a program of multifamily housing co-ops at Champlain Housing Trust in Burlington, with a further background in union and community organizing. She is also a founding board member of the Vermont Real Estate Cooperative. Matt Kropp, there you go. Matt's the executive director of the Vermont Employee Ownership Center and does solidarity economy finance work in that capacity, as well as in a number of volunteer roles. In relation to cooperative real estate, he serves as board treasurer for the Vermont Real Estate Cooperative, board chair of the Oak Street Cooperative, and as chair of the Vermont Solidarity Investing Club, which invests exclusively in cooperatives. Trenda Lofton is a social justice consultant, theater artist, worker owner of the Compost Cooperative, co-founder of Willow Permanent Real Estate Cooperative, and a realtor with Coldwell Banker Community Realtors. She believes housing is a human right and is actively seeking ways to increase access for those who face barriers to safe and secure housing. And she believes one of those ways is through cooperative economics. And I'm Maggie Cohn, a loan and outreach officer with the Cooperative Fund of New England. CFNE is a community development financial institution, a nonprofit lender guided by a mission to work for economic, social, and racial justice. We've been lending to cooperatives since 1975. Most of the money that we lend out comes from individual investors in CFNE and by cooperatives that invest in CFNE who support building the cooperative economy. I am now going to hand this over to Julia and Meredith to start us out.
Thank you. And thanks everyone for coming on this call. This is just very exciting to be able to talk about this stuff and hear your questions. Meredith and I were asked to kick it off because in our prep, I think we just lost her for a second. Oh no, okay. In our prep, we really got into kind of teasing apart the elements that are normally in our mainstream culture, bundled together in the concept of owning real estate. And we realized that the different kinds of models of community ownership that we all work with kind of recombine the different aspects of what we've been taught to think of as ownership, as very individualistic ownership. So we kind of got into, well, what, when you do tease those apart, what are the different elements? And I know, Meredith, you were talking about, from your perspective with the land trust, kind of some of your organization's goals around that. So maybe you want to share that.
Or yeah, just the whole concept, what does ownership mean, really is a hard question to answer. And as Julia just said, I think a lot of times we assume it means individual ownership, but there's really a continuum between individual to community ownership, and there are different models along that continuum. So for example, like if people are building equity, that's a form of ownership, but equity also can be, you can build it in a lot of different ways. So for example, you could, if you own a home and you're paying off the principal, that's equity, it's your own equity. But if you, if you don't own your home, but you're saving into like an account or into a retirement fund, or you're investing in a local business and you're getting dividends, you're also building equity. And it's also individual equity, though it might be benefiting the community. But there are also ways to think about ownership that are about like a shared model of equity, where you might not be pocketing the equity itself, but you are collectively sharing it. And maybe it's through the way you govern, or you have decision-making responsibilities for a property that you all share. Even though you might not walk away with money in your pocket or in your bank account, you're still collectively deciding how to run that property. And in that case, it might be something that benefits the whole community. So it's community equity. And then there's also other kinds of equity that can be shared or transferred. Like you might buy a share of a building you're in, and maybe you're in it with a bunch of other people, and you're all buying shares as part of your, instead of paying rent, you're paying into a share model. And then over time, you have a share in that property, and whether you take it with you or it stays in the property, that can be decided. But so there are all these different ways of thinking about equity and ownership. And our land trust, Boston Community Land Trust, Boston Neighborhood Community Land Trust, most of our, right now, all of our properties are rental, meaning the people who live there are paying rent. But the way our organization is structured, we have our board is made up of, a third of it is residents who live in our properties, a third is the community members, and another third are people who bring resources. But in this case, because the board is the sole member of the organization, all of our ownership entities are controlled by the board, which of course is made up by the community. So in that sense, yes, our organization might own a property, but it's the community that owns the organization. And over time, we also will have home ownership opportunities for people through a variety of ways. It could be rent to own, or it could be that they're able to save money into ownership. So people can also think about ownership and still be part of the community land trust. So that was just some of our conversation.
Yeah. And I guess I would add that I think in the work that I've done with cooperatives, I do see what can be a tension between, individual or household wealth building and community wealth building. And this is definitely something I think that all of our organizations that are trying to get out of, take properties out of the speculative market are trying to figure out, well, where do we want to land on that range, right? So the commonality that we have is we're all taking properties out of the speculative market. And to me, that's kind of like, that's where to be, right? But then you can really slice that in a lot of different ways. The housing cooperatives that I used to work with, people were not building wealth by living there. What they got was rent that stayed as affordable as possible and perpetual leases. So they had just a high level of, life security and predictability around their finances and their housing. Sometimes that, is the make or break to a community, and to people being able to raise kids and pursue work, et cetera. So that's a clear benefit, to those folks and to the neighborhoods where they live, but they're not building wealth, right? So, but in addition, they also have, control over the building where they live. And I think that is another feature, tenants typically don't, right? So that's maybe another a parallel range, right? Where tenants typically aren't going to have a lot of control. Co-op members will typically have more, but they may not be getting, the wealth building out of it. they may be getting the security and the control, and that's their benefit, the affordability. So different, I think it's really helpful to tease out sort of which of those goals a group is going for, or what they see as possible given the financial, universe that they're operating in.
I'll just add one more thing too, which has come up with our residents who live on the land trust, is to create a peer-to-peer fund where if people, because they're able to stabilize their rents, if there's, they could make a choice to put some of their savings into a shared fund. And then they can decide, okay, this month we're going to help this person buy books for college, or we're going to, help this person is a little bit short on rent. But they as a community are again, it's not exactly wealth build. It's not individual wealth building as much as it is community wealth building and support. So wanted to throw that into the mix too.
Yeah, I wanted to jump in because I love what y'all are sharing around the reality of the tension between individual wealth building, community wealth building. Apparently, I can't say that phrase, and how essential it is, right? Especially since so much wealth is built through the ownership of homes, of really real estate, period, right? How do we start interrupting that a little bit? I love that invitation, right? To be thinking about the variety of ways that we can co-steward land and co-own homes. Yeah, so I get excited thinking about all of those options, and curious about, because I think that sometimes there can be that either or thinking, right? And Meredith, you had mentioned the continuum of ownership, and one of the things that we're exploring is what structures will allow us to utilize the variety of options, right? So that folks are both being able to build that individual wealth that can be passed down through generations, right? As well as community wealth. So that's something that we've been thinking about.
That's all great stuff. Thank you so much for doing that. And that's actually thank you, Trent. That's a really nice lead in. I think for talking about housing co-ops, I think they're in many of the co-ops that we lend to, that tension between building individual wealth and the benefit that comes from creating community wealth can be really obvious. So I want to start out with a disclaimer, which is that I am not a housing co-op expert, but many of the borrowers we have at CFNE are housing co-ops. So I've had experience with a variety of types of co-ops, and I will certainly ask my fellow panelists to chime in with any additional insights that you may have. Cooperative housing in general is a form of collective ownership by a building's residents. And it can be any type of house, or it can be a manufactured housing park, right? It can be a single large Victorian house with a lot of bedrooms. It can be a small, in Boston, a 3-family house, or a smaller, a larger apartment building. But each co-op is a corporation. The residents each own one voting share in the co-op, and they generally elect a board that controls the co-op and makes decisions about the property. So what I see is basically what I've dealt with are like 3 kinds of co-ops. There's one that I've heard referred to as both a group equity and a no equity co-op, which often is a larger single family house, or perhaps a small apartment building that is owned by a nonprofit or a trust. And the residents might control day-to-day operations. The trust or the nonprofit provides the board sort of the higher governance function. And people do not really accrue any individual equity. They might put in money that is essentially a security deposit when they move in, and they get that back, but it doesn't accrue any value while they live there. and they're owners in that they share in control of the property, but they're not owners in that they have put money into purchasing the property or walked away with money. In a limited equity co-op, the residents do purchase shares, although usually at a really deeply affordable price. And those co-ops are usually built with some sort of subsidy money. They will be restrictions on income eligibility for people to buy in. And then, like with the group equity, shareholders pay a monthly carrying charge that covers co-op expenses, including maintenance, insurance, taxes, all that kind of stuff. For both limited equity and group equity, the properties are usually purchased with a loan, often from a CDFI or from a bank. The amount of money that the organization that purchases the property has to put in as an initial down payment can be raised in different ways. It can be raised through city grant or municipal grant or subsidy money. Group equity houses often run campaigns where they take out allied loans from friends and family. And those are loans that are longer term and more patient and are subordinate to the bank debt that purchases the property. They might have sort of individual supporters who can put in more money towards the down payment that makes the purchase of the property possible. And then there are market rate co-ops, which are all over New York City, and there are some in Boston. But in those instances, the property, again, is owned by the cooperatives. The shares are usually sold at market price, and the ownership of a share entitles the owner to the use of their apartment, but they don't own the apartment the way a condo owner owns the apartment. They can't sell to somebody without going through some sort of approval process by the co-op board. And again, their share gets them whatever the size of their apartment is, 1 vote for the co-op board and a participation in governance that way. So, and for those co-ops, one issue is that banks don't like to make loans to individuals to buy shares in cooperatives because it's kind of unclear to them exactly what the collateral is. They can't seize a share. I mean, they can, but then what does it get them, right? With a condo, there is an actual physical apartment that serves as collateral. With an individual house, there's the house that serves as collateral for the bank. So this is an issue that that there are some banks that will make loans to individuals to buy their co-op shares, but not very many. In Boston, there is a fund that has just started in the Fenway specifically to make share loans to people to buy shares in, I think specifically in limited equity co-ops. Julia, you talked about the Champlain Housing Trust, and I know you do a lot of work with ROC communities. Can you talk a little bit about what this looks like in both of those instances?
Sure. So the Champlain Housing Trust is one of the oldest community land trusts. It learned that model from the folks in the South who pioneered it, the Black farmers who pioneered a land trust as a way to control land. So it started creating cooperatives along with rental housing and individual home ownership. And originally, it was before I was there, but I believe that originally the financing was just loans to the organization, right? So the Housing Trust is a nonprofit, so it has access to all the funding streams that are available to nonprofits. And then each of the properties is an individual partnership, subsidiary to the nonprofit. So the trust was able to directly get financing and work with some partners who are willing to take that bit of a risk on cooperatives that Maggie mentioned in terms of collateral, because they knew that CHT was, kind of standing behind them. as their program grew, they started, and for many reasons, they stopped creating these small cooperatives and shifted to developing new properties. And the method they use, they have a whole sort of pipeline and machinery of developing new properties with tax credits. So that is how most of the existing co-ops there were financed, and that doesn't cover all of the financing, but it's a huge percentage of the cost needed. So those properties do still have a mortgage, but it's a much smaller mortgage than it would otherwise be. So the other model that I work with now is the resident-owned communities. So these are mobile home parks, which is what, you know, regular people call them, or if you're trying to be, you know, very proper about it, manufactured home communities. So this is a housing model that may be unique to the US, where these manufactured homes started being built in the 60s. And people just started creating these very dense, quote, parks, you know, communities of these homes, typically in kind of out of sight spots, often in sort of floodplains, on land that wasn't so desirable for other development. So what happens is people can buy their manufactured home that exists in one of these parks, but they're paying rent on the lot. So they own their home, but they don't have security of land tenure, which puts them in a really vulnerable position when the parks go up for sale. And especially now, Wall Street has discovered that there's money to be made from these communities, and they are buying parks and jacking up the rents all across the country. So the resident-owned ROC model, resident-owned community, was developed in New Hampshire by a man named Paul Bradley, basically, who his mother was living in one of these communities, and it went up for sale. And he was casting around for a way to help the residents buy and control the community, and found that with the help of the New Hampshire Community Loan Fund, you know, as a nonprofit partner. So the model, and over time, you know, many more of these were created, and he saw an opportunity to bring this model to national scale. So he led the development of a national nonprofit / CDFI, right? So the ROC USA and ROC USA Capital have a whole, it's really like a cooperative franchise, right? They have a whole model where a community can adopt a set of bylaws and organizational structure and get financing that includes, crucially, a pre-development loan to let folks do the diligence, you know, to figure out if they want to buy the community and what it will cost and line up the financing. So ROC USA Capital will finance those purchases, but communities can also seek and get other financing, you know, that may be available. But that pre-development loan is what enables any of that to happen, because it can take, you know, several months and engineering work and all kinds of, you know, all the legal work to figure out if title is clear and if they're really buying a lemon, or if they want to buy that community. So that model, I think, is part of what's interesting to me is, you know, people are willing to form a cooperative, not because they're kind of necessarily inherently drawn to that way of life, but this is what will give them, you know, the security, permanent control of the land under their homes, permanent control over the cost of their lot rent. And it has, you know, some of these communities run into real challenges once they own the community around infrastructure, which has typically not been invested in since parks were first formed. So it's not as if everything's, you know, simple, but they're in a position to deal with that. They're in a position to solve those problems, and have control over the situation to the extent, you know, that they can.
Trenda, do you want to share a little bit about the housing co-op that you've been working on in Western Mass?
Sure, would love to. Hi, everyone. I feel like I didn't properly say hello, so I'm going to just take a moment to say hello and thank you all for being here. I I feel like I'm relatively new to the co-op world, like the technical co-op world, though I've been a theater artist and that is all about cooperating for sure. So I definitely transfer those skills over. So I am, as was mentioned before, I'm one of the worker owners of the Compost Cooperative, which is actually a food scraps hauling business that was developed inside the Franklin County Jail in Greenfield, Massachusetts, as a way of, so it's designed inside with folks incarcerated there as a way of providing a pathway to not only meaningful living wage work, but also ownership opportunities for folks who carry records. And so a couple years into running that business, we really learned that while meaningful work was a barrier for a lot of folks when they're getting out, more urgently, perhaps, was actually finding housing that was safe, affordable, and sustainable. A lot of folks that came to work with us were, you know, in halfway houses that were unsafe for them, in the basements of, you know, family who were, you know, selling drugs or whatnot. So also not safe or sustainable. And so we as a business, you know, not only for the sake of our business, but for the sake of humanity and recognizing housing as a human right, we're like, what do we do? Because we had been doing this work to advocate for folks, for other landlords to allow them to live in apartments, and folks just kept saying no. So that's when we decided really that we needed to kind of take control of that situation and see what we could do about being able to offer that housing ourselves, to be the landlords. Hate that term, but it's, you know, common language right now. And so that's where we really started dreaming about what it would look like to own a building with multiple units that, you know, folks who are working with the compost cooperative, other folks who face barriers in housing who are connected to co-ops could have access to something that was affordable, safe, and sustainable, and also offer a pathway towards ownership of that building as well. So we're very much in the works. We were able to crowdfund that, crowdsource that house. We bought a dilapidated multifamily. It was originally a 2-family, which we're converting into a 3-family through our partnership with Oxbow Design Build, which is another co-op. So something really powerful about co-ops coming together to make things happen, because the compost cooperative on its own was not in a position financially or skill-wise to both be running the food hauling business and, you know, establishing a housing co-op, especially one in a price point that we could afford, with the amount of work that would need to go into that. So that partnership for us was crucial in getting this far. And I know one of the things that we're talking about here are some of the challenges that that we face in trying to get this established, and especially around funding. So true story, raising the funds to purchase the house, that was pretty simple. We were able to move really quickly once we shared what our intention was, what the vision was, what the plan was. Community rallied around that. Right? There's an acknowledgement that people need housing, and that folks who have been incarcerated are some of the most excluded groups of people from that process. So folks really rallied. We were able to raise, you know, over $90,000 to purchase this dilapidated building outright. So that part was simple. And then it got into the bigger money of it, and looking for ways to fund that. And it was it is and continues to be I see you, Camilla, and we can talk more about the crowdfunding process for sure. You know, the challenge is when you're doing a unique situation when you're envisioning something that not a whole lot of people have done, though it's exciting to keep learning how many people have done it. The systems that are in place, that have been in place to keep people excluded, those remain. You know, banks don't necessarily get really excited about, you know, a crew of cooperators with not independent wealth, not being able to personally back a loan that they're taking. So continuing to explore a variety of options. CFNE, or the Cooperative Fund of New England, has been instrumental in helping us, you know, really think about how to create something that's sustainable, right? Financially viable, which is complicated, right? I think there's an ask, not only for us as cooperators, but also in partnership with lenders, with community, right? To understand that there's risk that we're all taking in this, like, crafting and dreaming of something new. So I think I might pause there, because I think that there are multiple avenues to be explored. And I would say at the same time, I will say one more thing. One thing we found is that through the city, the actual municipality has funds connected to renovation, especially if you are committed to maintaining affordable housing. And I'm going to go with the little a instead of the big A, meaning like little a is we are making a choice to keep rents affordable, as opposed to the big A where we're like externally controlled and monitored to do that, because we feel really committed to maintaining a level of autonomy for people who end up being residents of our house, which is another one of those tensions, I think, that we ride as a co-op. I will pause there.
I'm going to ask Meredith to take us through a one-on-one on land trusts.
Okay, well, that was great, Trenda. I really love hearing that story. I think for us, for Boston Neighborhood Community Land Trust, we're a little bit, our niche is specifically right now trying to keep properties, especially occupied properties, from getting bought up by, frankly, greedy investors. And we, like, in a city like Boston, I'm looking at the chat feed, it's really hard. The market is so strong, it's so bull, and it's not changing. Prices are only going up. And, 70% of purchases are by cash buyers who don't really care what the condition is. They'll just put the cash on. They might not even be from Boston. That's what we're up against. And so, as we all know, what that means is the rents go up and properties get converted into these luxury units, and people, where do they go? There's nowhere to go. So, our organization started out in the foreclosure crisis to purchase properties that were about to disappear through foreclosure, and to buy up properties to help people stay in their homes. And we continue to do that work when it's relevant, but it's not just foreclosure, it's also gentrification. There are all these, forces that always hurt the same exact people. So that's what we're trying to do, is make sure people can stay in their homes, or, in some cases we will purchase a vacant unit, but we'll try to, it's to keep the neighborhoods stable, and to make sure people who live in those neighborhoods can move into these properties or stay in those properties. And then, one of the differences between a land trust and, say, just like a typical affordable housing unit, Trenda sort of alluded to this, is that we're in it for the long haul. So it's not like, okay, we've got a funding source for the next 15 years or 20 years. We're going to keep this property on the land trust forever. That's what, like, you can set up a ground lease. If it's an ownership situation, the land trust buys the lands, but they sell the house. But you have a ground lease that says the house has to stay affordable over time. People can still build up some equity, but when they sell, the intent is to keep that house permanently affordable, which is really important. I mean, there is a real tension here, because, like, we all know people, especially Black renters and anyone deserves to buy a house and build equity, right? And that's not like, there's this huge disparity. Someone mentioned the $8 versus the $250,000 gap there. And that's huge. But at the same time, we also need to make sure there's affordable housing for the whole community over time. So how do we do that? And I think we're all here talking about ways to do a little bit of both. We both want to have stable communities where people, if they can't purchase, they can stabilize their rent and they can be in charge of their house and their building with their neighbors, and they can start to build. There are a lot of ways to build wealth and equity. And then also, ideally, for those who want it, to help people on a pathway to purchase. You know, there's some really creative rent to own pathways where you might start out as a renter, but over time you start to be able to build up the resources to buy the unit you're in. Or maybe in the case of the land trust, you buy another unit on the land trust, but you're still part of the same community. So basically the way it works for us, our model for our renters is we'll look for a property. A lot of times we'll look for a property where the tenants are already organized. They're already maybe, you know, in some cases they've won a struggle, like to make sure that they don't get evicted. We work closely with City like Feeder Urbana, for example, and they'll do a lot of tenant organizing to win collective bargaining agreements or anti-eviction agreements. And then those, which is great, that's half the battle. But then how do you make sure that they can stay in that property forever? And that's where the land trust can come in and purchase the property. And then we have all these folks who are already organized who really want to be part of the land trust. So it's a win-win situation in that case. We'll also, you know, sometimes other properties we'll hear about as well that we'll purchase if we can. And to do the purchase, the way that part works is we do rely on a subsidy. So we do rely on whether it's city or state. In our case, we've been recently using city. There's an acquisition opportunity program that helps finance. You know, whenever you take a public subsidy, it does come with its own set of regulations and restrictions. However, if they're putting up hundreds of thousands of dollars to help you get the property, it's worth it. And we still have a gap that we have to fill. So we fill that gap by we do get loans. Ideally, we try to work with lenders who are CLT friendly with good terms. And then we also, Maggie had mentioned earlier, the allied subordinate loans, like from friends and family, like just putting the word out for folks. Like, if you can give us money at low interest, like we'll just create a fairly informal note with them. Like, okay, we'll use your money for 5 years. We'll give you a modest interest, like a 2%. Every year you'll get that back. And then we promise to give your full money back in 5 years. But in a lot of cases, people will just recycle that. So 5 years might roll into 10 years, which is super helpful. And also, meanwhile, we're building up our own equity by paying off our mortgage with the primary lender. And so as you do that, also you can refinance that so that if you need to pay back your subordinate lenders, you can. So that's a strategy too. And then we also, there are people, you know, Trenda talked about like the easy part of putting, if you're really clear about what you're trying to do, there are fortunately a lot of people out there who are really invested in the same work we are. Everybody knows this is a huge issue. So there are people who have enough wealth to be able to donate. I mean, not forever, like the scale part is harder, but for certain projects, you can usually raise at least some of the money that you need to help fill the gap. So that's how we've been able to do it. And, you know, even better if you can find a friendly seller who's willing to go to the low end of the market, or sometimes even lower, like give you a below market deal. Best case scenario, yeah, I see Trina nodding, but that's harder to do, but it happens. And we do actually have a couple of folks in the community who have pledged to donate their homes to the land trust when they pass. So that's another strategy. So basically that's how it works for us. And so we will acquire a building and we will immediately, our goal is to help people stabilize. So they still pay rent, but they're stable. But over time, we are working to think about ways for people to move into like an equity building pathway. And so that's part of our work too. And if that means home ownership for them, great. If it means, other kinds of equity building, investing in local businesses, great. We are open to all of the above. And we are also, over time, I mean, we've only been a land trust for a couple of years. Over time, we will also do home ownership right away, right from the get-go, which is how a lot of land trusts operate. So that, again, as I explained, the ground lease, we would purchase a building. In some cases, you might develop a building, and then you would sell it below market using subsidies and whatever you can to bring that price down for a buyer who is income qualified, at like, ideally you can go as you want to try to aim low, like for people who might be at 60% of the median income, if you can. Usually homeowners are at like 80%. So if you can go even lower, that's great if we can do it. So that's just the basic 101 about our land trust, Boston Neighborhood Community Land Trust.
I'm just going to throw in one fact, which is there's a Somerville CDC, I forget which one it is exactly, that has a program that they've been rolling out asking homeowners to either donate their houses or to sell at below market. And the difference between what they sell it to the CDC for as affordable housing and what they could sell it for on the market, the homeowner can take as a tax break. So that's just something to sort of think about as people are looking at acquiring property. It benefits both sides. I know, Julia, you had talked about mentioning new market tax credits. I'd like to jump over that and ask Matt to talk a little bit about PRECs. I'm just cognizant that we're running a little bit longer than I thought we would, which is not to say that this isn't really interesting to me, but I also want to be able to open this up to folks in the audience. Thank you, Matt. Thanks for that.
And yeah, and I'll also probably tag in Julia because we are both on the board of the Vermont Real Estate Cooperative. But yeah, so Vermont Real Estate Cooperative is one kind of manifestation of this idea of permanent real estate co-ops, and ours was inspired by a few other examples. There's one that's been around for a while in Minneapolis, one really interesting one in Oakland, and plenty of others around as this kind of model gains traction. But so I think one way of thinking about it, and I think there's a few kind of nuances that make it different from these other models that we're talking about. But one thing I think is way of thinking about it is as essentially a consumer cooperative, like say a food co-op. What you're buying is space rather than groceries or getting loans in a credit union. And so what that means is when people are buying in, they're not buying in to ownership of their individual units, but rather buying into ownership of this essentially holding company that can be owned by community members on a cooperative basis. And that means you kind of have two types of members. You have both folks who are potentially renters or tenants of this real estate holding company, so they're kind of co-owners of their landlord, so to speak. But then you can also bring in community capital through members who are not tenants, but who receive a limited return on capital. So the real estate co-op is governed, just like all consumer cooperatives, on a one member, one vote basis. In the case of Vermont Real Estate Co-op, a share is $1,000. And members can own more than one share, in our case, with a limit being no member can own more than 10% of the total shares. And so owning those shares gives you a few rights, right? As I mentioned, voting for the board of directors, which kind of makes strategic decisions, decides what the dividends are going to be every year, sets a budget, does all of those kind of important governance related tasks. Also, say hires a property manager if that's going to be done not in-house. And financially, there's kind of two flows of money. You have, on the one hand, as a tenant, you essentially each year, if there's profit, as a consumer co-op, that profit can be allocated to the members, kind of prorated by how much rent they paid. So every year there might be a cash dividend to tenants, or a cash patronage refund, it's called. And the co-op might also retain some of that for, say, future growth, or kind of setting aside a reserve or other things. And so that builds an internal capital account for each tenant member, where there's some sort of limited equity that's been built up. But it's not equity that's attached to the market value of the particular properties, but rather it's this kind of obligation that the co-op has over a long term to its kind of tenant members. And then the other thing is, the other sort of flow of money is an annual dividend. And so this is for, important for both tenants and non-tenants, but is the only flow of money that goes to non-tenants, which is to say each year, in order to attract, say, that member equity that provides the down payment to purchase a property and capitalizes the co-op, the board will look at its books and say, all right, were we profitable? Do we want to issue a dividend? And in our case, we have a hard cap on, we will pay no more than a 6% dividend per year. And then, in years where we don't feel comfortable paying out in cash, we might do a deferred dividend. So in our first year, of operations, we didn't, for most of that time, we didn't own the property. We didn't have really any income, but we wanted to provide some consideration for folks who had put money in early. And so we said, okay, we'll declare a 2% deferred dividend that will pay out kind of at a future date for that particular year. And so that's the kind of mechanics of the very basic mechanics of the thing. And there's certain considerations to think about because you're kind of raising capital from community members and relatively small dollar investments, that, knowing about the local laws is kind of around securities is quite important, because co-ops tend to have some very, some important securities exemptions, but there's nuances to them. And there's some places where it's easy to issue, say, like non-voting preferred shares. So maybe everyone owns one share, and if people want to invest more, they can invest in a second class of shares. In other places, like Vermont, actually, that's more tricky and difficult. And so it really made sense for us to more just have people own multiple of, the member shares, even if they own more than one, they still only have one vote. So there's, it's not a totally kind of reproducible model in every exact feature in each state, because you need to kind of adjust for the legal environment a bit. And the final thing I'll say before seeing if Julia wants to weigh in on some of this is kind of around the permanency question, right? There's kind of, when you think about permanent, there's this continuum that can go from things where, okay, well, maybe there's 5 years of affordability and then you can do whatever you want, to, something's held in kind of an ironclad trust and could never be sold. As a democratic organization, it can be difficult for a co-op to stay with the co-op values of maintaining the autonomy of the cooperative, while making something as ironclad, say, as like a trust ownership, like with a land trust. But you can still put in some fairly significant barriers or requirements to demutualizing the cooperative. And we took inspiration from Equal Exchange, which is a worker cooperative that actually is headquartered in Boston, who wrote into their bylaws that if they're ever sold, everyone is made whole, and then any proceeds that go out beyond, everyone being kind of paid out, are to be donated to another fair trade organization. So in our case, we said, all right, and if we're ever sold, any kind of windfall gains, the price of our portfolio doubles, everyone's like, let's smash the piggy bank, right? No, like, that has to be distributed to housing and cooperative nonprofits, so that the work is continued. That was the sort of purpose why we created this thing. And actually, I said that was my final thing. But one other thing that what Trenda said, actually kind of, and I'll maybe talk a little bit more about this when we get to investment clubs, but about kind of having the motivation for something like this in some ways come out of a really sort of a specific identified need. That when we were, there was conversations for several years about wanting to get something like this going in our community. But the catalyst, the kind of the kick in the pants to actually do the organizing work was, there was a cooperative that was trying to find space to establish itself, and a selling owner who was kind of interested in selling a space and was going to be patient, which kind of, in some ways, we refer to this as our training wheels project, in that, the selling owner wasn't putting it on the market for other folks. It was like, okay, take as long as you want. I have a tenant. I can just keep collecting rent and paying my mortgage until you do that, which gave us, as a new organization, time to kind of collect ourselves and a sort of reason to want to secure this particular space. And now that we've done that, we're starting to think more proactively, right? Sort of thinking about, all right, we're looking for a multi-unit apartment building for our next project, and thinking about doing a fundraising campaign. But that sort of like having a clearly defined sort of project and purpose to sort of prime the pump and get this thing started was really key to going from, hey, that would be a nice idea, to we have this as an existing institution in our community. And I'll pass over to Julia for any other thoughts on this.
I am so eager to get to the Q&A. Oh, sorry, I'm also echoing. That I would say, unless Maggie, you think there's something essential to cover, let's just go to that.
No, there's been a lot of activity in the chat. I really want to get to a more open discussion, and I think Sierra is going to facilitate this for us. Thank you.
Thank you all so much for the spirited chat. There's been a lot going on. So as Nia might usually do, I'm going to shout out some comments and then I'm going to get to the questions. So from Joseph E., equity is much needed in the Black community to increase the average net worth of the family, i.e. $8 is the average net worth of Black families in Boston per the Federal Reserve 5-year study in 2015. We do have a question here from Noise, I hope that I'm saying your name correctly, who says, I agree with Joseph. How could a city planning agency view equity in the context of the earlier conversation? And if you would like to unmute and add a little bit more context to your question, you can feel free to do so. Okay, I'll give another second. Does anyone want to take this on?
I mean, I would say from my experience, one issue with cities the tension between a city sponsoring affordable housing or subsidizing the development of affordable housing and the need for people to be able to utilize their housing as a way to create individual wealth is this long-standing practice of saying if public money is going into it, then the individuals living there should not be able to take wealth out of it. I've been thinking about this a little bit sort of through a reparations lens, in which case you could say if public money goes into it, then people absolutely should be able to take wealth out of it. But that's not the way it works at this point. And so finding other ways to finance affordable housing that are not reliant on state and city subsidies, mostly state or federal subsidies that have a lot of restrictions on them. I think that that's really important, because until that happens, I don't see individuals being able to build equity.
All right, thank you, Maggie. We have a comment here. Oh, sorry, did you want to go ahead?
No, that's I'm just saying that's from my perspective. I'd really love to hear if other people have other ideas about that.
I guess my other thought is that I have seen in other times and places, right, in deindustrialized cities, where cities were able to, they had control of a resource that could go to help, lower income folks build wealth. Whether they allocate it or not is a political question, right? But at this point, it seems like the much bigger issue is the rampant, speculation, right, and the wealth gap. So in the places that I'm familiar with, right, the problem is just rich people buying up the properties, in which case the city, as such, I think may have fewer tools. And it really is a time to think about how can other actors in the community come together.
I think one other thing I would throw in, I think there's that question of, and I think there's this tension that we've all been touching on, but that question of how hard can or should, and is it right to lean into sort of pushing for the decommodification of housing versus pushing for the sort of the equalization of it as a commodified wealth building strategy, right? And I think I don't think there are easy answers to that because of the history of huge amounts of institutional racism in housing and access to credit and all of that. But I think there's kind of a certain political question really around, do you, does home ownership create a certain set of political commitments around pulling up the ladder behind you? If it creates some zero-sum game dynamics in terms of if that's where wealth is being built, then and your goal is to have a higher value to your property, then you're going to start to try to restrict access to other housing politically. And there's certain kind of coalitions that can form around that. And we definitely can see that happening in some places. And so I think that there's this there's this question of prioritization and this balance even within organizations that are doing this work around how much in terms of the resources that are kind of pulled in from, not necessarily from outside investment, but from the reinvestment of cash flow. Does it make sense, or should rightfully be allocated to the wealth of current residents, tenants, and that sort of thing, versus expanding the capacity to deliver sort of sustainably affordable housing to people on an intergenerational, long-term like stewardship basis. I think that's a sort of hard conversation, again, with no easy answers, but it's one worth having for sure.
Trenda, I feel like you want to say something too.
You noticed. I want to, I'm going to try to bring in some of the questions I also saw come through the chat too. I think such key important things to consider, right? And for me, I keep coming back to the both and. And I don't know that it's the right answer. But I think for me, I'm all about what are all of the options that we can be exploring while acknowledging the current system that exists, right? One of the internal struggles as I work to establish a PREC here in Western Mass as well, is the reality of like, who was it? Joseph, I think, said, right? Like that we need ownership. We need ownership in Black communities, in Black and Brown and immigrant communities. And I definitely agree. And I think one of the questions that comes to me, right, is, we can have ownership in houses, and we can have ownership in businesses, right? When I think about Willow PREC, that's a name drop. That's the permanent real estate cooperative that I'm establishing with a crew of QT BIPOC folks out here, right? Is Willow PREC is a business, right? And so if we're building wealth and equity and ownership in the business, right? I think that is one approach. That's why I'm so stoked on what EB PREC is doing, right? And has been doing. I'm so stoked on what's happening around the country, right? Where folks are really thinking about, how do we do the both and, right? People are gonna keep buying real estate. It's gonna happen. I don't see the magic wand yet making that go away. And so if we can be building our ownership around a core value of, for us, we really make the distinction, we don't believe that when you are purchasing something on stolen land that you own that. Right? I believe you can own your home and build equity in your home, right? But that you purchase the responsibility to steward the land, right? So what happens when we separate the ownership in those ways, right? Which I think is one piece that land trusts can do too, right? Sometimes there are the people own the home and the land trust owns the land, right? And so that can be one way of making that distinction. Yes, so diversifying the way we think about ownership, right? And building both access to home, access to land stewardship, access to business ownership, right? We're committed, and I think, Matt, you do this as well, like recognizing the direct relationship between having stable housing and having stable work and having space to own and run your business out of, right? So we really recognize and are working to do all of those things and to create a business that can hold and support a variety of dreams. Someone had asked, like, $1,000 is a lot for a share. And I'm like, yeah, yeah, it is. It's not a lot when you think about what First, Last, and Security go for. You know, at least around here, but it is still a significant amount of money. And so one of the things EB Prec does is, right, they separate it out a little bit, right? There are those $1,000 shares, but you know, community investors, community owners have options. What they do is, like, you know, either $10 a year, $10 a month, $10 a week, right? So we can build out options, right? So for those for whom it's like, what, $10 a week is nothing. That's 2 cups of coffee, right? Then do that, right? And you'll be investing in that community building as well. So I'm gonna pause here because I get excited and fired up, and then I go on for a long time. Pause me for.
Can I throw one thing related to that question of for small dollar supporters, is that, you know, one of the things that our real estate co-op came out of was the Vermont Solidarity Investing Club, which is this club that exists to invest in cooperatives and kind of has become, to a certain extent, a bit of a community of practice of folks who are interested in cooperative economics and supporting, you know, cooperative economies generally here in Vermont. And so one of the way that that's set up is that the people can basically set up to invest between $20 and $400 a month. And then the group votes on what cooperatives to invest the money into. And so it really, you know, had 2 major impacts. One was, you know, certainly it was kind of an incubator for the idea. It was discussed within the investment club before it became, you know, an independent project. But a second thing was, it was a way for folks who weren't able to necessarily come up with $1,000, but were really sort of in alignment to have some exposure to the project. And so when we were kind of getting near the finish line, we'd raised almost enough money from for the down payment, but we had a gap. And so the investment club was able to, you know, voted to invest about to make a loan to the real estate co-op of about $6,000 of the accumulated cash that it had at the time that helped us bridge that gap. And that was, you know, that $6,000 was coming out of the monthly about $1,800 of all the members of the investment club, of which there's close to 30, who are kind of contributing and on a regular basis, sort of making investments in this broader cooperative economy. And so I think that, you know, I think it's important to think about that accessibility. And there's always the balance of, I'd say there's 2 considerations around kind of when you're thinking about the minimum. One is, you know, when you create a minimum, you don't want people who could come to the table with more, but they see $100 and say, oh, $100 is what I should put in, when they could come to the table with 1,000, right? There's kind of a balance there. And then the other piece is the question of kind of the community investors, folks who are just coming in, are not tenants but investing, and then the folks who are going to be in the space. And for a lot of co-ops, and you know, one thing that they'll often do is that if there's a sense of that kind of at the front buy-in is too high, then allowing people to buy in through installments. So I know a lot of worker co-ops that I work with might say, you know, all right, it's going to be $1,000 or, you know, $2,000 to buy in, but you put $100, $200 down, and then there'll be a little payroll deduction every month or every pay period until you're bought in. Similarly, I think, you know, so there's real estate co-ops that allow for that as well, so that the folks who are living there aren't going to be excluded from, you know, being co-owners of this project just because they can't come up with that extra $1,000. And they're all, you know, when what Maggie was talking about in terms of that lender for buying co-op shares, there are some, you know, some lenders who also might even make individual loans to people, which I've seen in the worker co-op world. But I think in general, sort of like, you know, thinking about through what are those policies that make sure that the people who really do need to be at the table, who have the most, who are most impacted by the decisions made by this organization that's, you know, stewarding their housing, have a seat at the table, have a, you know, vote for the board of directors and can serve there, rather than simply, you know, thinking, you know, thinking of themselves as, oh, I'm, you know, just a tenant of a slightly more humane landlord, right?
Thank you, Matt. So I'm going to move on a little bit. ABK says, somebody mentioned earlier that the shared real estate cooperatives can separate resource allocation from the bidding process, which I think is great. But there's still a need to figure out who should be eligible to purchase properties. Are there best practices for facilitating the sale side of below market rate properties fairly when someone wants to sell? Who does this really well? Are there potholes to avoid? And I'm going to drop it in the chat again so y'all can read it.
So I'm certainly not, I don't feel like this is an area where I have a ton of expertise. I've just seen a few cases, right? I know that there were times when Champlain Housing Trust has been able to buy properties below market. And that again is, I think, because it's a 501c3 nonprofit, and that enables the sellers to take advantage of some tax credits that they get for the difference basically between the appraisal and what they sold for. So that's one very specific, you know, highly structured way of doing it. In the case of our real estate co-op, it was really personal relationships, right? It was the network that we knew the man who ultimately sold our first property, and he was aligned, you know, he was values aligned with our goals and with cooperatives.
Just to clarify just a little bit, so I'm thinking more about the tenant side of things, you know, in that providing somebody with a below market rate unit, house, whatever, is essentially providing them with some financial gain, right? You know, it compared to the rest of the market. And the question is, well, how can we fairly decide who gets that gain? And I guess I worry a lot about only relying on networks of social or people that are known, because that's exactly what keeps wealth where it is today. And I would love to hear resources or case studies of folks who have done this fairly and really well. I know it's hard.
The city of Boston, when there's a property that the city of Boston has financially supported that builds affordable housing, they run a lottery and people apply. The city has a team, they go through all the applications to see who meets the criteria. And then they go through that list. You know, it's like whoever gets on the list first, they work their way down through the list. And as they get to people, those people have to see if they can actually come up with financing to purchase the unit. And they do that until they've sold all the units in a building. So it's a fairly transparent and fairly blind process, I think. The issue that comes up with it sometimes is if there's a property in a community that wants to allow people in that community to buy in that community, there is no provision with the city of Boston to prioritize people from a certain neighborhood. Which, you know, I think there's something really good and strong about that, but there's something also that can sort of undercut the growth or the tightness of a community. In properties that are not, where they're not like mandated to go with the city system, I don't know how they do it.
The city has created, at least for rental and rental lotteries through a fair marketing process, there is a preference category that's based on the neighborhood. So that it's limited, but that does exist. So you could do something like that. So it's not, you just have to be within the zip code. So yeah, there is a preference category. I also just wanted to pick up on this point because I think there's like a really interesting, I mean, this whole conversation has brought up a bunch of like challenging questions about how we do this work. And sometimes we feel like we're at odds. And a lot of us are saying, well, we just have to be creative and resourceful because there's a way to, like, if we're flexible, there's a way to tackle both sides, which I think is true. But one thing that's hard just to name is public processes are regulated and often very fair. So they protect for things like this. So ABK brought up that point, like that's why we have regulations. On the other hand, sometimes they limit us from being as flexible as we want. So I don't really have the answer. I'm just sort of naming that dilemma. You know, our organization, 100% of our residents are BIPOC and from our local community. If we, you know, if you just open up that citywide with lottery, it changes. I mean, the population of the folks who live in the land trust will change. It'll be fair, but it will change. It won't necessarily be neighborhood specific. So it's just one of these things, like how can we be, when, you know, if you're attracting money, for example, how do you make sure it's not just this like close-knit community that's attracting money and it's benefiting the same people? And yet, what if you're actually really trying to reach deep into a community that doesn't usually get access to those resources? Shouldn't there be a space to be able to provide money to that explicit group? Anyway, I don't have the answers. I'm just bringing up the dilemma.
Well, and I think for me, right, it brings up that question of equity versus equality, right? If there is this, like, we've got to keep it equal, right? Like if equal is what equals fair, right? Then we're going to keep replicating the systems that have been oppressive to so many, right? And so I think that I appreciate you really painting that picture of what happens if we just like open it up. And right, like my solution is, how do we just have more things in community control and, you know, decommodify housing and make it so, because I believe whether you have a lot of money or not, that you should have access to housing, and if that is community controlled housing and you've got, you know, a couple million in the bank, but you're like, yes, community housing, cool, we need you too. So for me, I'm like, how do we, you know, I really see this as a multi-class or cross-class movement, because I think that that's what's going to make it big enough to change the system.
Thank you. Camilla, I see you have your hand raised. Would you like to say something?
I do. Sorry, I'm driving. Can folks hear me?
Yep,
Yeah.
we can. Yep,
Yeah.
we can.
Okay, cool. I've been learning so much. This is such a great conversation. Thank you to everyone. So I guess I just have a my position is one of I don't own anything. I am fortunate enough to be the child of two immigrant parents who, like, a very traditional immigrant story, came here, et cetera, worked 500 jobs, and now they own something. They've been able to purchase a house in Revere, which right now is like a very hot piece of real estate, with Suffolk Downs being like so deeply developed. And they have not been exposed to these different types of real estate frameworks. I actually don't know if they're on this call. I sent them the link because I was like, can you guys listen? And so I'm interested in, you know, what Trenda brought up, this notion of understanding that anything I purchase on stolen land is not inherently mine, but I do have a responsibility to, therefore I have a responsibility to it. And so as a child of these two owners, they trusted me to manage this property as they age. And I'm listening to all of your conversations, understanding like what is an avenue that I could propose to them? Like, what is a type of real estate framework that I could propose to them that will allow them to be like be okay in their retirement because this is the only thing they have for themselves, without letting go, without selling the property, and therefore, you know, contributing to that house flipping thing that people do. That's a big question. I'm sorry.
A great question.
Great question.
So I will say that one of the things that our real estate co-op has discussed doing is starting a property management co-op, because co-ops need co-ops. And it would be interesting to, you know, maybe develop a federation of property owners who want to, you know, who need the income stream, but don't want to be extracting more than they need. You know, to enter into some type of collaboration there and work with a property management company that understands those values. That could be one direction.
One other thing that I'll throw out, and a lot of my work is with, you know, talking to business owners, thinking about ownership succession and creating a plan that can take several years or can take a long time, but that both, you know, meets, say, a small business owner's retirement needs. If, you know, most of their assets are in this one business and that's what's going to carry them, you know, with economic security into their old age, you know, with the desire to sort of exit in an equitable and fair way that preserves a legacy and sort of honors the work of the employees who've helped build the business and all of that. And so I think there's some parallels to in that way to the situation that you described, where it could be something thinking about, you know, what are the immediate steps, and then but what could be the long-term plan that could meet those needs, that could be, you know, a structured sale, you know, to a tenant cooperative, or you know, setting a sort of a milestone at which you would kind of go from the current ownership structure to something like that. You know, I think it's often a delicate balance of people's kind of their financial needs, their sort of community and values needs, and sort of like just having those honest conversations to get to the point where that is, you know, where people feel like they can be safe to do what feels to be perhaps more the right thing versus kind of feeling cornered into having to maximize everything out of a kind of a place of fear in many cases. So I think that's especially with people who've lived in poverty and are now kind of having resources, you know, for you know, that at a particular stage of life, like there's a lot of trauma to work through and beyond that goes far beyond sort of just having a surface level conversation about this sort of thing. So yeah, big question, but you know, and definitely an important set of conversations to have and be thinking about as you think about your position kind of in the flow of intergenerational wealth.
Mm-hmm. I'm tempted to say, you know, for me, there's that long-term vision, which I think, you know, Julia and Matt were kind of talking about. And then there's the like, what can we do? I'm queen of having an idea and then just like putting it out in the world and seeing what happens, which can be really powerful. But I wonder what it would look like if a portion of one's rent, right, was considered like it's a part of the maintenance, right, understandings. And if at the end of the year, you know, you didn't have to, you know, do certain things, like, is there a portion that can be returned, right? Like, thank you for investing in this home because you're taking care of it and we didn't have to do XYZ. Then you get it back. At least a
Profit sharing.
portion of it.
Just to add, I think in the donated houses, for the people who are thinking about doing that, one of the models there is they get to live there, and as long as they want. It's just the idea is they're creating, it's almost like they're creating their own restrictions so that it will be affordable. They won't be chased down by investors, and that when they leave, they know they're leaving this legacy behind. you know, and there are ways to do it. Like if you don't have to do it a full donation, it could be discounted. There's so many ways to do it where you can still like capture some profit through the next generation and build your own wealth, but still leave this legacy of something that's not at that, you know, there's a huge gap between you making some profit and what the market can bear. So if you can leave a combination of community legacy as well as being able to build your own ability, you know, your own wealth and assets, that's another way to think about it too.
Word. Thank you all so much. So we're going to move on to the next question from Shaniqua. Do all cities and states have subsidies that can be tapped into for the acquisition of cooperatively owned spaces? Or is it just, you know, some? I see Julia shaking your head.
That sounds so lovely. It's not, yeah, we don't have that here.
I think there's a huge variety of different resources out there that are both directly state or municipal, but also, also kind of things like the CDFIs like Cooperative Fund of New England or Shared Capital Cooperative and others, where I think that's a whole nother level of the work, right? Which is, one level is kind of making these deals happen, and another level is how do we build the financial infrastructure to make our ambitions become the possible futures bigger, right? And when I started in on this work, coming up on 15 years ago, the Cooperative Fund of New England was a fraction of its size, and the size of a deal it could do was a fraction of its size. And what's possible in our region is bigger because they were able to grow. And so thinking of this like larger ecosystem of support networks and, funds and investment clubs and individuals figuring out how to use their retirement savings to support community, these kinds of community projects. They're all pieces of the puzzle that, that need to be cultivated in order to allow us to do more of these things and grow the snowball bigger and bigger.
Okay. We are at 7:34, so I just want to do a little temperature check. Give me a thumbs up if y'all are willing to go for another 10 or 15 minutes. Okay, I got a 5. Okay, Matt, I hear you. So this is our final question. Has anyone partnered with land banks to access properties, for access to properties?
I think that might be there might be regional answers to that. The places where I know of land banks are places that were deindustrialized and have a lot of vacant land, yeah, so that's not what I'm seeing in my little corner of our Turtle Island.
Okay, no one else? Well, with that, someone mentioned that as a common practice in Detroit. Maybe that person could chime in. Are you still on the call?
I know that Nia has mentioned this, but I had mentioned it earlier. This is Margot from Detroit. Yeah, there are several land trust projects in Detroit that are using our vast, large land bank. But I will say that the warning, it's a very delicate process because the land bank is also used for people who grab a ton of land at once, right? So it's a very delicate process for community organizations to acquire land, because once a developer is aware that is happening in a certain area, they can jump on it and use their power to get that land really fast. So it's like very secretive, protective, the way that organizations are getting land through the land bank, because if the news breaks out, then it's that much harder. So, but we do have a land bank, and it should all be land that's in a land trust.
Thank you, Margot. I see Jean with your hand raised. Did you want to ask a question?
I was just going to add on to the land bank process. I was been doing some real estate deals out in Ohio, and they have a program. Their website is makeitincleveland.org. And essentially, what they'll do is if there's some vacant land or an area that has been blighted, if you have 10%, they'll give you 90% of the money, and then they will forgive up to like 170 grand. That's an interesting program out in Cleveland called makeitincleveland.org. But I'm very much out of Boston. And I will say, I have a book out. You can see the title of my book is private. It's the Private Lender Blueprint, how to passively invest in real estate as a private mortgage lender. And that's not me looking for anybody's funds here, any capital here, but I'd certainly like to work with you. But it's more so for me personally about looking for more creative ways on how to get property. So I have a license, but I started off as a wholesaler. So buying and selling properties without a license. And I did that by accident in Massachusetts. And so as somebody who's looking for different ways, this conversation is great. And I think if we can develop a new culture, right? Because if you're trying to get the American dream, you want to get your house, now you have to learn a new culture of how to help other folks out while making yourself whole and making your family whole. So this is it's going to be a big paradigm shift. I think we're ready for it, and I'm looking forward to it.
I love that. Yes, let's all get ready for the paradigm shift. And with that, I'm actually going to close this out. So we do have a little poll. Don't leave just yet. I'm launching the poll now. You can tell us what our next CFNE and UJIMA workshop will be. Also dealing with housing. And I'm going to thank you all for attending A Loving Embrace. I'd like to start out by thanking our esteemed guests for this amazing presentation and discussion. I also want to thank our partners again for their support of A Loving Embrace 2021 Real Estate Assembly. After you finish the poll, let us know in the chat if you've had a great time. If you'd like to learn more about UJIMA and our work or become a member, you can visit www.ujimaboston.com and follow us on social media at UJIMA Boston on all platforms. You can also follow CFNE at Co-op Fund NE. And if you have time on Wednesday at 12 p.m., join CFNE for Better Together, a workshop which explores best practices in intercooperation and community engagement. Later that night, you can also join us at UJIMA Wednesdays for our political and financial education workshop series. And if you feel so moved, you can visit our member teams to co-create UJIMA with us. On December 10th, you can join our study team, which has been learning and studying community land trusts. And this month, they're going to be talking about co-ops, land, and land use laws. So if any of y'all want to nerd out about that stuff, join us from 7:15 to 8:30 on December 10th. If you are a UJIMA member, please make sure to check out our upcoming voting opportunities. Right now, you can vote on the Cultural Assembly ballot, which is moving $60,000 to artists and organizers for public art projects. And please be on the lookout for the real estate ballot, which is coming up in December. Thank you for joining us. Stay safe and have a good night.
Thank you, Sierra.
Yes,
Thank you everybody for coming.
Thanks so much, everyone.
Yes, have a great night, everyone.
You too.
Yeah.
I am.